Welcome everyone to week 10. We will be discussing the message audit this week. So as you may remember from last week, we focused more on the media environment in which our clients operate. And so when we did that, we looked at metrics like volume of coverage and reach of coverage and tone. And this week what we're going to do is explore a different type of audit, and that's the messaging audit. So we're going to look at creating a framework that we can use to objectively measure and evaluate our clients' messages. So what can you expect to get out of this week's class? One of the first things we're going to talk about in the lecture is how we define the term message, and specifically how that term is defined in the field of communications. We're also going to be exploring the use of and the importance of the message audit, where we can find messages for this audit, and then we're going to look at some different types of frameworks that we can use to analyze messages and do a deep dive into one of these frameworks, and that's the one that you'll be using to evaluate messages as part of your assignment for this week. And then finally, I'm going to walk you through my thought process for analyzing a set of messages. So let's talk a bit more about how we define a message in the context of the communications field. When I was just Googling around on the internet, I was just trying to get a sense for general ways in which the term message is defined, and I came across a couple of different definitions for the word, and a few of the first ones that I came across I thought were pretty simple and probably not appropriate for the way that we think about message when we're talking about how it relates to the field of communications. So those first few, a message is information which is sent from a source to a receiver, or an arbitrary amount of information whose beginning and end are defined or implied. I think my big issue here in this definition was the word arbitrary. I never like to think of messaging when it comes to communications as ever being arbitrary. And then I came across a couple more definitions that I thought were becoming increasingly more complex and nuanced. The first being the point, moral, or meaning of a gesture, utterance, novel, motion picture, etc. And the second, a message is a vessel which provides information. Its meaning is dependent upon the context in which it is used. The term may apply to both the information and its form. So in other words, what we're seeing here is this idea of the medium being part of the message, not necessarily the entire message, but part of it. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with that phrase from Marshall McLuhan, but what I think this is really saying to us is that context does matter. So you can't necessarily separate a message from, let's say, the fact that it's being conveyed through the social media space, or how it would change that message if it was being conveyed through a television commercial, etc. So sort of looking across these definitions, as well as my own experience working in the field of communications, I've created what I would like to consider to be a working definition of the term message for us as we move through the rest of this lecture. So let's talk about how we want to define message within the communications field. And here's what I put together. A successful message is not just one that transmits information arbitrarily, but one that is specifically designed to share information to a particular audience that will in turn impact the behavior of that audience. So really what we're seeing here is a much more strategic type of definition for a message, something that's designed with an express purpose in mind, and something that's designed to reach a particular audience and impact their behavior in a specific way. So what is a message audit? This is something that we do to assess messages, and primarily the degree to which we believe they will convey their intended meaning among their intended audience. So it's really just a tool that we use, a framework that we put in place to objectively measure how effective messages are. And that's why it's important to have that framework in place to ensure that objectivity, because oftentimes the way that we talk about messaging can feel a little bit subjective. So I believe, I feel that these messages are good because of X, Y, and Z, versus I know that this message is objectively better than this one because I'm evaluating it based on these specific criteria. So that's really what a message audit does, is it helps us evaluate messages in a way that feels like it's based in something in certain specific criteria that then can help us determine one message from another. So why are message audits important? This is another great question, and one of the biggest reasons, and I think, as I'm sure many of you have recognized over time in your work, from the perspective of our clients, messages are oftentimes our currency, or their currency, I should say, and the degree to which these messages are picked up and covered is a way in which they choose to measure themselves. And so it's very important for us as practitioners to be able to help them in that evaluation process. The other great thing about a message audit is it can be used to help us evaluate how we can improve our messages. And so that can be from the perspective of the content of the message. So what is it saying? How is it being said? Is it relevant to our target audience? As well as the placement of that message. So where is it being delivered, in what medium, and is that particular media or medium reaching our target audience in the most effective way that it can? So let's talk a bit more about how we actually go about conducting a message audit. The first step that you're going to take is to choose the sources. And this is one of the most important steps, because typically we can't necessarily analyze all of an organization's messages or that of its competitors. So what we need to do is figure out how we can collect what we feel to be or know to be a representative set of messages from across a range of different sources. And the way I like to think about the two types of sources is, one I would consider to be internal, and so that would be anything that the client has created themselves that they're pushing out, so something like a website, their own website, any collateral materials, brochures, pamphlets, that type of thing. And then external messages, and those are messages that are picked up by other sources and then pushed out. So that could be an article in a newspaper that says something about the organization that you're looking at or the client that you're working for. Or maybe it's in a social media forum where somebody is saying something about your client. Those would be what I would consider to be more external messages. But anyway, when we're thinking through our sources, it's good to let your client know ahead of time, here's where I'm going to look, and I'm going to evaluate, let's say 3 to 5 messages per source, just so that at the outset you've agreed on where you're going to go for those messages, as well as the volume of messages you're going to analyze. And that really depends on the amount of time that you have and the budget that you have. The second thing that you are going to want to do is define the framework that you're going to use to evaluate these messages. And as I mentioned before, this is really important because message audits are not something that we would consider to be a perfect science. And so having some sort of predefined framework or criteria brings a level of objectivity and also minimizes bias. And this is something that I would also recommend floating by your client ahead of time to make sure that they feel comfortable with the framework that you're using and feel like it's relevant to the messaging strategy that they're looking to employ. So to help you prepare for your assignment this week, I'm going to go ahead and walk you through the sample framework that you're going to be using to analyze those messages. And this is one that I use a lot when I'm conducting a message analysis for my clients, because I feel like it's pretty versatile and works for a lot of different messaging objectives and for a lot of different types of clients, and works across various sources. So I think it'll hopefully be very useful to you as well in your day-to-day role. So just a bit of background about this messaging framework. It's really predicated on the notion that a messaging strategy is greater than the sum of its parts. So in other words, your messaging strategy should have an overall objective, and then your individual messages will ultimately work together to help you meet that objective, rather than having a number of different disparate messages that sort of work to do their own thing. They should be working all together to really push forward some sort of messaging strategy. And so what you're going to see here is the different levels of messages that would work together to really meet this overall strategy. And there's going to be some messages that we would consider to be a bit more foundational in nature. So they're really just conveying the basics of who you are and what you do. And then other messages that we might think about as being more inspirational. So they're giving your audience a reason to believe in what you're saying and giving them a reason to stop what they're doing, pay attention, and ultimately act as a result of your message. So the three levels that kind of help us better differentiate between those that are more basic in nature and those that are more inspirational are included here. So a level 1 message, this is a message that communicates facts and figures and details, descriptors, those types of things that are relevant to the organization. And then a level 2 message is one that serves to differentiate an organization from that of similar organizations or competitors by really communicating what those strengths and benefits are. And then the final level is level 3 messages, and those are really used to convey the personality, the character, the vision, the motivators of the organization. And one thing that's really important to remember here is that you wouldn't want an organization to only have level 3 messages, even though these ones probably sound like they're the most compelling. They really serve to build off the previous two. So if I don't know who you are or what you do, it's very hard for me to be inspired by you or to really get a good sense for your personality. So it's important to lay the groundwork with those foundational messages and then sort of really motivate the audience with that third level. So ultimately, what you want is a strategy that works across all 3 levels and has messages operating in the different areas. And what you typically find, at least in my experience, is that most organizations have more messaging that operates in those first 2 levels and less in that third level, and that's fine. But you just want to make sure that you're not only talking about facts and figures and descriptors and some strengths, but you are having those more emotional messages that really serve to connect with your audience. Now, before setting you off on your own and asking you to conduct one of these audits, I thought it might be helpful for you to see my thought process as I would conduct one of these myself. And so I'm going to run you through a sample message audit here. And this is actually an exercise that I did because I was looking to become a volunteer for organizations that help mentor at-risk youth. So I was doing a lot of my own research into these different types of organizations, what they offer, how they could appeal to me as somebody who's looking to volunteer. And so the 2 that I looked at were Best Kids and College Success Foundation. And what I'm going to do here is walk you through level 1, 2, and 3 messages from each of these organizations, and then my analysis of why I think one may or may not be better than another, as well as the quality of these messages, and then my potential recommendations for how these messages could be improved. So I'm going to go ahead and read through 2 examples of what I would consider to be level 1 messages from each of these organizations. As I'm reading these, I want you to think about, in your mind, the extent to which these 2 examples of level 1 messages really meet the criteria of what we think of as being a good level 1 message. So something that is conveying just real descriptors, letting us know who you are and what you do, and then I'll talk about what I think in terms of these 2 messages. So the first one comes from Best Kids, and it reads, Best Kids Inc. is a 501c3 nonprofit organization that provides mentoring to foster care children in the District of Columbia's child welfare system. Foster care children are the most at-risk population of children in America. Research studies show that 4 years after being emancipated from foster care, fewer than 1 in 5 of these youth were completely self-supporting. And then here's a level 1 message from the College Success Foundation. This one reads, College Success Foundation, District of Columbia, is a nonprofit that opened its doors in 2007 to serve low-income students and students of color in Wards 7 and 8 in our nation's capital. CSF DC is a subsidiary of the College Success Foundation. With a significant grant from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, it assists students in six high schools by providing scholarship support and mentoring to help them earn a college degree. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I thought of these 2 messages after analyzing them and using the framework. I felt like both of them were adequate in the degree to which they provide basic information about what they do, but I do think that the Best Kids example is stronger because it uses more compelling facts and figures to really demonstrate to me why they're important. So this idea that fewer than 1 in 5 of these youth were completely self-supporting, a quarter had never earned a high school diploma or GED, that's telling me as a potential volunteer that there are some kids here that are really in need, and you're giving me some data to back that up. In contrast, I felt like the facts and the figures that were used in the CSF example were a little less compelling. So, as a potential volunteer mentor, I'm less concerned about which wards you focus on. Well, that's important information to know potentially for somebody. Personally, that's less important to me than what I got from the Best Kids example, which is why these children are in such desperate need of mentors. So what I used here to evaluate, the criteria that I used here was, what types of facts and figures are you sharing with me that are going to back up why the kids that you're talking about are so at risk? So we're going to take a look at some level 2 messages from each of these organizations. And as you probably recalled from our discussion earlier of a level 2 message, this is something that's really designed to build off of a level 1 message, to not only tell our audience who we are and what we do, but also about our strengths, the benefits that we bring, and some of the things that differentiate ourselves from our competitors and other organizations. So as I read through these, I just want you to be thinking about how each of these messages is doing in terms of conveying its unique strengths and benefits. So the first one is from Best Kids again, and this one reads, Best Kids is operating under the first ever volunteer mentor partnership grant with the District of Columbia's Child Family Services Agency. Under the VMP grant, Best Kids mentoring program is able to provide volunteer mentors for children as young as 6 and continue as needed until they reach the age of 18 years old. The next message is from CSF, and this one reads, CSF has over 10 years of proven experience inspiring underserved, low-income students to finish high school and providing the unique integrated system of supports and scholarships they need to graduate college and succeed in life. With offices in Washington State and in the District of Columbia, CSF works with public and private partners to ensure that our scholars receive the educational and financial incentives necessary to achieve their college and career dreams. So for the interest of time, I'm just going to look at Best Kids. I'm going to give you my analysis of that one. What I'd love for you to do is, as part of the discussion for this week, give me your thoughts on the level 2 message from CSF. So let's talk a bit about Best Kids first. My assessment here was that this level 2 message in terms of quality was fair. One of the first things that stood out to me about the message is the first line, where they tell us that they are operating under the first ever volunteer mentor partnership with the District of Columbia's Child and Family Services Agency. I thought the phrase first ever was good in that it signals to me that this is a unique partnership, but I still don't have any idea, based on the content of the message, why that's actually important. So it kind of takes me halfway in terms of differentiating. So one potential recommendation here, if they were my client and they were asking me to evaluate the quality of their messages, I would say that they could bolster this message by providing more information as to why this partnership with the DC's Child and Family Services Agency is so important. Why does that matter? And having it be a first ever, what does that really say? And then they go on to sort of differentiate themselves again when they say that they are able to provide volunteer mentors to kids as young as 6. So again, as young as, that suggests to me that they're maybe the only, or among the few organizations that can actually provide this type of mentoring to children that age, but they don't actually say that explicitly. So what I would recommend here would be to either be more explicit in that point to try to differentiate and make themselves unique from other organizations, or to provide some additional statistics or data points that do serve to differentiate them in other ways. So let's talk about some level 3 messages. And these types of messages are often the hardest to achieve because, in many ways, it's not that hard to talk about who you are and what you do, but finding that point with your audience that really matters to them is something that can be a lot more difficult, emotionally connecting. And I think that's true of any sort of interaction that you have. Speaking more rationally can come naturally to people, but when it comes to making an emotional connection with an audience, that can be a bit more tricky. So as I'm reading through both of these, think about how well they each do at really emotionally connecting with the audience and whether or not they're really conveying to them why they matter. So the first one comes from Best Kids, and this one reads, when you volunteer with Best Kids, you redirect the path of a young foster care person's life. Being a Best Kids mentor will change you as well. You will be able to share ideas with other mentors who are mentoring similarly aged youth, and your mentee will be made part of a peer group whose activities will help support the relationship you two have. And then we have this message from CSF, and it reads, the success of the CSF DC model is rooted in effective mentoring. It's simple. By sharing a minimum of only 1 hour a month with a mentee, you will be inspired. So let's talk about my analysis of these level 3 messages. And as we talked about earlier, this is an important level because it is something that builds off of an existing foundation. And what it's trying to do is to really motivate somebody to take action. And in order to motivate somebody, I have to oftentimes explicitly tell them exactly how it is that they can benefit from whatever it is that I'm trying to get them to do or trying to sell them or what have you. And so with this in mind, I think you can see some pretty obvious daylight between these two messages and the degree to which they really meet that level 3 quality as we've defined it using our messaging framework. And what you can see here is that one message, that of CSF, is simply telling me that I will be inspired, but it's not really showing me how. And this is a key component to getting somebody to buy whatever it is that you're selling. How is it that this is going to benefit me? And I can't just expect them to believe me. I need to back it up with something. And I think the Best Kids example really does do a good job of this. They explain fairly explicitly that you will become a mentor and they are going to put certain things in place, such as peer groups and training and activities, to help support that relationship versus you will be inspired, which is what CSF does and doesn't provide any sort of extra detail as to how I will be inspired. So the final step that we're going to talk about is providing recommendations based off of the audit that you conduct. And this is one of the most important components, and this is something we've touched upon in previous lectures, and that is really conducting an analysis and then taking that analysis and showing your client what they can actually do with the information. And in my experience, this is the section of any type of presentation or report that I put together that the clients tend to spend the most time with, because what they're really looking to do is take this analysis and improve their current strategy in some way. And so making these recommendations actionable is very important. So some of the key things to consider as you're putting together messaging recommendations are to answer, the degree to which you think that their messaging strategy is really operating across all 3 levels. So having messages that are in that foundational level as well as the more emotional level. And then once you've kind of determined that, the next thing you want to do is give them some recommendations on, whether or not they need to have more messages in that foundational level versus the emotional, or vice versa. And then you want to take a look at the quality of those messages. So they may have messages that are foundational in nature or emotional in nature, and a nice mix between the two, but if those messages aren't necessarily providing the types of information that are needed to really convey their message, then you have a problem. So when we're looking at the quality of messages, we want to think about if they have in that foundational level more basic information like who they are and what they do, that we've talked a lot about that already. And then also kind of building off of that, okay, so then what are the strengths and differentiators? And how are they different and unique from others? Are those types of things being called out in compelling ways? And then finally, are they making that emotional connection? Are they explicitly telling their target audience why they matter to them, and potentially setting themselves up to motivate behavior change in some way, shape, or form? So as you're looking across the quality of those messages, those are some of the things that you're going to want to be thinking about in your recommendations. And so as I showed you in my example, some of the things that you can be recommending along the way would be to think about how they can use, let's say, facts and figures to differentiate themselves a bit more, or how they could back up some of the more inspirational or motivational language with some real examples of how that could come to life. So this week's assignments. So what are we going to be doing this week? I know I've already mentioned that you're going to be conducting your own message audit. A couple details about this. You're going to be working in the same groups in which you worked in week 4 and on the same client to which you were assigned in week 4. And if you want to go ahead and look in Blackboard under week 10 assignment, you'll see more details in terms of the rubric, the due dates, and just more details about the assignment in general. But in a nutshell, we're going to be following the same framework that I walked through in this lecture, so you'll be using that 3-level messaging model. There's also going to be a short reading this week posted in Blackboard, and I just wanted to give this to you because I think it's a nice example of how a message framework was specifically designed to evaluate health-related messages, just so you can get another perspective in terms of a different type of message framework, and one that is specific to a particular type of message, given that a lot of you are working in highly specialized fields. And then there's going to be one graded discussion, and that's going to be associated with this week's lecture, and I mentioned that already, and I'd like for you to just go ahead, and I'll put this in the discussion board, but to provide some of your perspective on some of CSF's messages, since I really covered mostly Best Kids messages in this lecture. And then always feel free to note any questions or observations that you may have relating to this week's reading or lecture in the questions and observations forum. Thank you all so much for your time, and I will speak with you next week.